at this stage. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Minister. And I would agree with you. The briefing document was very helpful to look through, and to get it so early was great to actually have time to absorb the facts and figures that are in that. But I'll now open to the floor, and we'll be taking Programme A 4.1 Housing. Deputy Casey, have you any questions for the Minister?
Just specifically in relation to the housing programme.
Just housing, yes.
I suppose my concern would be, and maybe this is normal, is the spend up to the 23rd of June. The fact that we haven't even reached a quarter of the total spend there, is that normal? And is it sort of focused towards the end of the year whereas total capital spend of 538, whereas up to the 23rd of June we've only 117 million spent. So it would be concerned that are we not spending the money, and if we are not spending the money, or does it come in the latter half of the year as normal? As this is my first attempt at this, I'm not 100% sure of what historically has happened in this case, and maybe it is catch up at the end of the year and the money is spent at the end of the year. But equally, if there's any money left over, that it would be allocated on top of the normal funding, that it wouldn't be cut the normal level of funding, would be my concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Casey. Thank you. Deputy O'Dowd, we've just started on the Programme A of Housing. Do you have any questions for the Minister on Housing?
Not at this moment, thank you. Sorry for being late, I thought it was 9:30.
Okay. Minister.
Yeah, no, sorry, just on the spend so far, Deputy, which is a fair question, and I would have faced this a lot in agriculture as well. A lot of the capital spend in departments is spent in the second half of the year rather than the first half of the year, in terms of getting projects actually ready for spend. But just to give you an indication in terms of the sense of urgency to try and get things done this year versus where we were last year. At this point in 2016, taking exchequer funding and local authority self-funding from the local property tax receipts, we've spent 2.5 times in housing capital expenditure compared to the figure last year. So this time last year we'd spent €45 million of the proposed spend. So far this year we've spent 117 million. We will be trying to ensure that we spend all of it, all of the estimated spend by the end of the year. Last year, the underspend, just so you know, that wasn't spent last year was €28 million in terms of housing spend, but we actually managed to bring forward €29 million we carried from one year into the next. So that money wasn't lost, if you like. It was added to the figures for this year, which.
Does that mean that 9 million is included in the 117 million?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, technically speaking,
I take the point. But if we weren't rolling on with a continued expenditure programme, if we stopped it now, that money would be lost. Yeah. But because we're rolling on from year to year, we're trying to, and this is the point I'm making. In a lot of the discussions we have on housing, the restrictions around delivering housing, and particularly with local authorities when I go and talk to them, the reason why we're not building enough social houses isn't necessarily money. I mean, money is part of the issue, funding is part of the issue, absolutely. And building the kind of numbers that the Housing Committee is asking us to build is going to require a lot of money. But also there are structures in place and decision-making processes and so on that mean that projects aren't happening at the pace that we need them to happen as well. So this is a process issue, as well as an organisation and project management issue, as well as a funding issue. And I think that's evident by the figures that we're talking about. Just on the mortgage to rent, that's recouped through local authorities. So yeah, it does come through us funding local authorities to facilitate mortgage to rent. But mortgage to rent has not been as successful as we would have liked it to be. When that was launched initially, I think people were talking about 5, 6, 7, 10,000 people might avail of it. It's only been a fraction of that. It's in the hundreds, not thousands. So we are looking at the mortgage to rent structure again to see if we can relaunch it. And redesign it if it's possible to do that in the context of the Housing Action Plan, because clearly that is an option that needs to be there for people. but it's not being taken up at the moment. I have some views as to why that is, but it is it's something we need to put a bit more thought into.
You know what the underspend is?
On which?
On the mortgage to rent, or if not, could you send it to us at a later stage?
Yeah. Sorry?
The problem that arose was...
Deputy Casey.
Yeah, just a few, and it's not specifically about the figures, but it's around the figures themselves. And first of all, it is relation to the subvention of Irish Water from basically motor taxation of nearly 586 million. But I suppose coming from a rural community that's seen local roads and regional roads deteriorate over the last number of years, the fact that only 30% of the motor tax fund has been now spent on roads infrastructure is a concern moving forward. The other thing in relation to the revenue stream for Irish Water is the commercial water rates. When will Irish Water actually be taking that over? Because at the moment, I don't know how many different commercial water rates there are out there, because the sooner the better we get to the end game in relation to this, till we find out exactly what we're subventing Irish Water. And finally, in relation to the environmental, I noticed the landfill levy has gone down again by another 25%. Now, this is worrying because in Wicklow, I'm seeing waste wrapped in plastic, stored and shipped abroad to be disposed of. So there's something gone wrong in the system. Number one, if our landfill levy is going down because we're not going to landfill, but it's cheaper to wrap our waste in plastic, store it, put it on a boat and ship it somewhere else to dispose of. So there's something gone wrong in the system in relation to that. You.
Deputy Cowan.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just maybe start at the end, just because it's the most current. First of all, Deputy, we are going to support group water schemes. So we've met the Federation who represents group water schemes. I think had a very good discussion with them. And we've reassured them that the supports that were there for group water schemes pre the introduction of the Water Conservation Grant will return to that level of supports again. They seem to be pretty happy with that. In relation to the transfer, I mean the transfer generally of water assets from local authorities to Irish Water, is happening over a phased period of time. So every now and again, I as Minister sign off on a next phase of transfers over. Clearly, Irish Water can't take everything in the one go, but as capacity builds, we transfer the management of water assets essentially from local authority management to Irish Water, which is the whole purpose of trying to switch to a single utility water model, to try and create economies of scale, economies of knowledge, and capacity, and so on. And I see the group water schemes in that context. In relation to sorry. Okay. So, in order for that to happen in relation to group water schemes, 2/3 of those in the group water schemes actually have to sign up to it. So it happens basically on the say-so of those involved in the group water schemes. So there's a bit of democracy there, and to make sure that this is happening with the support of the people who are affected. In relation to the landfill levy, I mean, we haven't changed the actual landfill levy. It's 75 euros a tonne. If you look at how that compares to our closest neighbour, for example, it's significantly less. So Ireland doesn't charge a lot comparatively to other countries for landfill, certainly to our closest neighbour. But having said that, the landfill levy is designed to divert waste away from landfill and is having the desired effect. But I mean, that's a combination of people producing less waste, but also some waste going abroad. Much of the diverted waste is recycled here. But yes, a lot is being shipped abroad for recovery in thermal treatment facilities. That reflects the fact that the economic downturn in recent years resulted in spare thermal treatment capacity in some EU countries. It also reflects the under-provision of thermal treatment capacity here in Ireland, And also, I think also what we're seeing is significant pressure on landfill sites in terms of space. I mean, we do have waste being, transited from the west of Ireland to Kildare for landfill. That's my understanding anyway. So I mean, we have real pressures in terms of available landfill capacity. And so we need to encourage more recycling, more reuse, more composting, more waste minimisation. And I mean, that was the whole thinking behind pay by weight in terms of what we had hoped to introduce this summer, but which we've now needed to change tack on to a certain extent and actually ease that transition in a way that households are more comfortable with. But but I don't think we should simply see waste as material that needs to be landfilled. We need to see waste as a resource that can be recycled, reused, and used for other uses as a fuel source and so on. I mean, I might read you a note just on water, just so you get a sense as to what the numbers are, because there are big numbers changing here as a consequence of the decision to suspend water charges. Arising for the suspension of domestic water charges, Irish Water has estimated that it will require an additional funding requirement from the state in 2016 in the order of about 181 million. This level of funding is on the basis that there is no significant change in Irish Water's scale of operations and capital programme from that set out in their business plan. Savings in customer cost and domestic bad debt provisions are reflected in these estimates. It is proposed that the increased subvention amount of 181 would in part be met by the conversion of the planned 2016 working capital amount of up to 58 million to subvention, which was factored in anyway. This would reduce the amount of additional subvention net of the working capital amount to 123 million. When account is taken of the savings from the suspension of the water conservation grant, for which €110 million was allocated in 2016, the cost of suspending domestic water charges is unlikely to exceed 20 million in cash flow terms in 2016. So I hope that makes sense. What's happening is a big chunk of this is being essentially met by the €110 million now not going on a conservation grant, but instead going into the local government fund to actually fund the water services that Irish Water are actually investing in and providing. So the net cost of that decision will be less than 20 million, and maybe considerably less than 20 million, and that figure will be worked out between now and the end of the year. In terms of the transfer of functions, can I say that my understanding is that the transfer of environment functions from my department into Minister Naughton's department will happen before we break up for the summer. That's my understanding. And as you know, climate change, air quality, waste management and the EPA are all transferring over. And there are real parallels in the Department of Energy and Communications with climate change and environmental issues, given the impact that energy has in terms of the overall emissions calculations from an Irish perspective. I think that's a reasonably good fit, and I think it'll work well. But that's what's happening. We can't factor in the changes in the estimates until that formally happens, and it'll be factored in after that. On the infringement cases, the note I have on that is that the UWWTD, which is the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, sets out the requirements for the collection, treatment and discharge of wastewater under urban areas. In September 2013, the European Commission commenced formal infringement proceedings regarding non-compliance with the requirements of the directive. Its letter in September 2015 outlined specific concerns in over 70 areas, although this list is not viewed as exhaustive by the Commission. A response issued in January 2016 and a follow-up meeting with the Commission took place on the 25th of February 2016. At this meeting, the Commission acknowledged that progress is being made and noted in particular the coherent national framework in which water services are now being delivered. They also acknowledged the significant funding allocation for investment in wastewater treatment in the periods to 2021 and beyond that will ensure compliance. The investment that's committed to between now and 2021 in this area is what, Maria? The
5.5 billion is the business plan and 2 billion of it.
Okay, 2 billion of the 5.5 billion euro a capital plan in the Irish Water Business Plan is allocated to that. I would say that I'm actually meeting the Commissioner next week, and I regard him as a very practical and sensible Commissioner, and I've got to know him quite well through his role as Commissioner for the Marine. I'm meeting him primarily to explain why we're suspending water charges, how the process during that 9-month period will actually work in terms of the work of the Expert Commission, which we announced the details of yesterday, and that feeding into an Oireachtas committee that will produce recommendations in terms of how Ireland should fund domestic water supplies and domestic wastewater treatment into the future. And let's see where that debate takes us. Certainly I will be looking for the flexibility and accommodation from the Commission in terms of what we're trying to do there, which is to have an informed review and debate of where the financing of domestic water lies in Ireland at the moment, so that we can make a democratic decision in Parliament in 9 months' time. And I certainly am hopeful that we'll get facilitation to do that. I know people have raised, Deputy Kelly has raised issues around this being illegal and so on. I just don't accept that. And I'm not quite sure where he's coming from on that. Clearly, there are issues if Ireland decides, in my view, there are issues if Ireland decides to abolish water charges in the future. But look, let's wait and see what our Expert Commission has to say on that in terms of their judgments around our obligations under the Water Framework Directive and so on. I don't think it serves a useful purpose to have that debate now when we have a group of experts that are there to actually make these assessments.
Just briefly in relation to the calculation of the local government fund, and specifically the surplus or the 112 million that's been forced by local authorities to spend on housing, is now having implications on other services within the local authorities. And in our own county, we've suffered big time to retain our recycling centres and our library services because of the way the calculation of the local government fund is being carried out, and the forced difference between the local government fund and the local property tax then being forced to be spent on housing. I've no problem spending on housing, it's just it's now putting pressure on other services within the local authority.
Deputy Dail.
As to what they think in that area. In relation to housing taking up a significant part now of local authorities' funding and so on. I mean, most of the new initiatives in relation to housing involves new money for local authorities, and local authorities need to gear themselves up in terms of staffing and expertise and so on to get back into the business of housing and building housing. To meet the needs of the social housing list and so on, and that's why, to be fair to former Minister Kelly, he fought for and got a significant increase in terms of capital expenditure around social housing provision, which is feeding into the local authority system. We've also, I think, granted about an extra 420 staff across the local authority system for housing as well, in terms of staffing ceilings, which again is, results in an increased commitment on spend, but also increases the capacity within local authorities to be able to respond to the housing needs. So, yes, housing is probably a bigger percentage of overall spend in local authorities now, but I think that reflects the priority that needs to be given to it, because it is the biggest challenge for local authorities right now in terms of responding to the needs of the people they're representing.
A few clarifications just in relation to the local property tax and when it's decided at local level, which is in September, and the budget is not till November, there's a disconnect there completely. And it's as a local authority member up until a few months ago, you're almost deciding the budget in September. And that's when the real budget decision, because you're making the decision whether you're going to have 15% to spend or not to spend. So is there going to be a harmonisation of that process? Because I think it becomes very hard on budget day then to get the budget through, because the real decision has been made in September. And just in relation to the surplus that you referred to in relation to the local property tax, in Wicklow we didn't decrease it last year. But that surplus over and above the local fund had to be spent on housing. And I have no problem spending on housing, but there's no democracy there. There was no flexibility of us to spend that extra money on any other service within the local authorities. And finally, I don't think it was a cheap shot of me at you in relation to Irish Water. I'm a rural dweller, so I've paid for my water all my life, and as a commercial user, I was. But we do need to get to the end game in relation to how Irish Water is funded. Yeah. My question was in relation to commercial rates of commercial water rates. There's discrepancies there throughout the country. There's various different rates being charged to commercial businesses, Wicklow being the most expensive in the country, but yet it's providing Dublin with all its water free. So I just want to know when we're going to get to the end game. The other huge revenue stream for Irish Water is the provision of services for housing. And there's a huge revenue stream there. So when or will Irish Water ever become self-sufficient? My only argument was that rural roads are beginning to suffer with lack of investment. That's all I'm saying. So only 30% of the motor tax intake has been spent on roads. That was only a point. It wasn't a cheap shot.
Yeah. No. And sorry, I mean that wasn't actually meant at you. But I've had other people.
Anyone here who makes cheap shots? Don't you know that?
I've had. I've heard people talk about this. As if water was never. No. Yeah. I know. Well, we've good, robust discussion in Fine Gael Parliamentary Party too. But this case is often made as if motor tax didn't fund water services for years, and it did. That's the only point I'm making. So I don't. But I do take the point in terms of the big decision being made in September, which really determines what's possible in the budget a few months later. I'm told the reason for that is that revenue insist on having that decision in September because that impacts on decisions that they have to make. But I do take the point, and I mean, don't forget that the budget cycle for government has actually changed now too. It's come back to October, and it used to be in November. In relation to the discrepancies and differences in terms of commercial water rates, the regulator, I think, will need to look at this area to try and get more consistency across the country in relation to commercial water charges. And I think my understanding is that is something that needs to be done. And the point you make around regional roads, I mean, I think it is a fair point. We have been through a very difficult period in terms of what government have had available to them to spend, and it's about prioritising within that. And that's where I think housing is now getting priority and needs to. But undoubtedly, and as you'll know as well as I do, in rural constituencies around Ireland, roads and the condition of them is a major political issue, particularly around local elections, regardless of what else is happening, whether there's housing crises or whatever. And we're cognizant of that in terms of trying to fund that. But this is about trying to get available resources and trying to prioritise it where it's most needed.
Thank you, Minister. Any other questions?
Yeah, I would agree with both comments in relation to the service being provided for council, especially when it comes to development plans. But just in relation to On Board Penala, and one of the most frustrating things with the board is their lack of decision making and kicking things down the road, I suppose, for 6 months and another 6 months. When we are resourcing them, is there any chance that we could look into that and make it a fixed time frame, similar to the planning process? Because I think it's unfair now on people out there that are just getting kicked 6 months down the road, on and on.
Deputy O'Dowd.
No, just a question about Portplanola is that
just on planning and councillors and availability of resources. I mean, I think there's an onus on local authorities to be able to ensure that councillors are given the resources they need, particularly around the development of plans. I take that. I mean, I was a councillor in Cork County Council during the development plan process many years ago, and to be honest with you, it wasn't a satisfactory process. I hope it's improved since then, and certainly, councillors will say to me that they get very frustrated in terms of the decisions that they actually have the powers to make. And one of the decisions that they have real powers in is around the development plan process and obviously budgeting. And they're really important powers too, that in some cases in the past, unfortunately, have made poor decisions. So the interaction between lobbying, councillors making informed decisions, and the interaction with their management teams in local authorities, needs to ensure that councillors have the resources available to them to be able to make the right decisions. I take that point. I think it's primarily a responsibility of local authorities, though, to make sure that that's there. But I think more generally, and I made this point yesterday when I was asking Dail questions, I do think, and we are looking at the resources that are available to councillors generally, in terms of ensuring that, one, they're valued, and two, they have the resources they need to be able to do the job that people expect of them, which is pretty demanding now. And people have become much more demanding of public representatives generally in terms of getting immediate solutions, immediate feedback, immediate information, and so on. Long gone are the days of people waiting for a clinic in a week or 2 weeks' time, or people writing letters expecting a response in a week's time. They want immediate responses to questions on social media and email and so on. So we're looking at that.